It is time to perform another scale audit on the diagnostics associated with a single CERT secure coding rule. So let's go into our Jasper audit project, and we need to pick a rule to audit. Why don't we audit FIO 30-C? There are two diagnostics, and it is priority 18, the most severe priority we have. So let's search for, or let's filter by FIO 30. There it is. And there's the two diagnostics. They're both produced by Fortify, and they're both about excluding user input from format strings. If we bring up the CERT rule, we can discover that format strings are actually quite sensitive information in a program, and if a user can control a format string, they can use it to crash the program or even overwrite memory and take control over the program. So it is important for format strings not be modifiable by a user. The usual easiest way to do this is to make sure that they are string literals. So anyway, Fortify is complaining of two locations where the format string is something that can be modified by the user, probably because it's simply not a string literal. So here's the first one, and in this case, the program is calling vfprintf. This function works like fprintf, except that it takes a variadic argument list rather than a random list of arguments. And in fact, what we see here is that this function, jazeprintf, is basically a wrapper around vfprintf. It takes its own format string in a variadic list, and it simply sends the arguments to vfprintf, throwing things to standard error. This is simply a handy function to automatically print something to standard error while looking like its own wrapper function. So, since the format variable isn't used anywhere except here, and here to indicate the beginning of the variadic arguments, it's clear that if the format passed to this function is not user editable, then this one is not user editable, and we would have a false positive. So what we need to do is check all the invocations of jazeprintf to see if any of them are unsafe. So there are a lot of invocations of jazeprintf, and it looks like a lot of them are taking string literals. So I'm going to search them all very quickly, just simply by doing a find and highlight of all instances. So I'm now searching for every instance where the first argument begins with a quote, which means we have a string literal. So every case that is highlighted here is clearly not a violation. So here's one curious case here. Let's look at this example. It doesn't seem to be called with a string literal, but if we look more closely, we see that, oh, whoops, it indeed actually is being called by a string literal. The string literal just happens to take 4 lines and not occur on the same line. So it wasn't visible in our quick search. But if we resume our search, we will look for any more instances. Okay, here's 2 more instances. This second cause is simply the declaration of jazeprintf, and this first one is simply a use of jazeprintf on a literal, so I'm going to skip those 2. And if we scan down, we're going to see that every other call to jazeprintf is highlighted, which means that only string literals are being printed, and we're done. Which means that there are no calls to jazeprintf, and consequently no calls to vfprintf that do not involve a string literal. Therefore, this item is a false positive. Moving on. This is a very similar case. A call to vsprintf takes a format argument, and we can see that this is actually a very similar case. This function is a wrapper around vsprintf, which is like sprintf, but takes a variadic argument list. So this case is similar. We look for jazzstreamprintf, a case that doesn't have a string literal as the format string. So this time I'm just going to search for a string literal for quotes, and as we can see, the first item here is simply the invocation. is simply the declaration. Every other instance has string literals. So this case, again, is a false positive. And since there are no true positives, only two false positives, then we found no violations of FIO 30-C, and we are done with this part of the audit.